Good evening, everyone. My name is Rima Chakra. I'm from the Experiential Education Unit, Office of the Vice Principal, Academic, and Dean at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. In collaboration with the Mississauga Library System, we welcome you today to our March 2022 lecture meet talk featuring Professor Rasmus Larsen. Dr. Rasmus Rosenberg Larsen is an assistant professor in the Forensic Science Program and Department of Philosophy at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Dr. Larsen's area of specialization is in forensic epistemology and philosophy of science, researching and lecturing on themes that intersect with scientific theory, critical thinking, and ethics. I'll pass it over to Professor Larsen, and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for this introduction here. I also want to thank the hosts for putting together this wonderful lecture series. There's some really interesting talks already being conducted and also in the future. So I'm definitely going to attend those as well. But let me just start with sharing my screen here. I assume this is okay for everyone? Yeah, so I'm here to talk about a psychopath or psychopathic personality disorder. And the title of the talk is Psychopaths. Are they dangerous social predators, or is it more of a stigmatizing clinical lore? I don't think this question is that easy to answer, but I think we are in the current research we're doing here in my group, at least, we're starting to get some interesting answers to this question. And you might be puzzled by this question to begin with, but hopefully after this talk, you shouldn't. I should have clarified some of those issues. So, but let me just say first a little bit about what I'm going to be addressing in this, just to give a bit of an overview of the talk here. So, first of all, talk a little bit about what psychopaths are, or what has often been portrayed as the problem of psychopath. And then I will talk a little bit about the research that my research group has been conducting over the past years. And then finally, I will try to address this question that is the title of the talk, whether psychopaths are predators or there's something like a clinical stigma going on here. Okay, so I think we can just dive straight into it. So let me just begin with perhaps the most simple question of all. So what is a psychopath, or this thing that we refer to as psychopathy? Or if you want to be clinically more accurate, what is this thing that we refer to as psychopathic personality disorder? Well, psychopath has been described here by a Canadian researcher, for example, Robert D. Hare, in his book Without Conscience, which is a book on psychopaths. He describes psychopaths as social predators who are completely lacking in conscience and in feeling for others. They selfishly take what they want and do as they please, violating social norms and expectations without the slightest sense of guilt or regret. And we're here getting the idea that there are these individuals out there that we call psychopaths, and that they are these social predators with all these different psychological qualities like lacking conscience and so forth. And we might also add to this that according to forensic psychologists and psychiatrists, psychopaths are not just individuals who have these peculiar traits. No, it's more that the reason why they have these traits is because that they are actually an instance of a specific personality disorder. So when we say psychopathy, we are actually referring to a clinical diagnosis that is a personality disorder. And when we say a person is a psychopath as a clinical psychologist, we are referring to an individual who has been diagnosed, if you will, with this personality disorder. So, for example, you might think that the person you have been dating the last 6 months that you broke up with is a psychopath, but that's not exactly what we're talking about in forensic psychology when we say psychopathy or psychopathy. We're talking about an actual clinical diagnosis here. And I should also add to that psychopathy is broadly acknowledged as one of the most researched and well validated and well established personality disorders out there. So that's just a little bit background. Of course, many of you probably have heard about psychopath before, and you might have your favorite stereotypical psychopath that you have in mind when people invoke this term, right? And perhaps the most quintessential stereotype is the American serial killer Ted Bundy, who many people know as this very peculiar offender who was found guilty of the murder of several individuals, also several very violent sexual crimes, and was eventually sentenced to death and was executed in the late 80s, if I'm not remembering incorrectly. He was also the first person to be prosecuted on live television, and which is also perhaps one of the reasons why he is so famous, quote unquote, or infamous, I should say, I guess. So Ted Bundy was, it's often highlighted as the stereotypical or the quintessential psychopath because he had this outer veneer or facade as if there's just nothing wrong with him, that he's a very affable, charming, kind person. That's at least what seems to be the outer appearance. But inside, if you will, if we dig a little deeper into his psychology, we will find this very, very abnormal and dysfunctional personality that seems to be completely incapable of being guided by what you might call moral values and social norms and so forth. And there's all sorts of books written about it. And lately there's a 4-episode Netflix documentary based on his life and the criminal case that is Ted Bundy. So you can explore that if you haven't already done so. Psychopath has been the focus of psychology for actually more than 200 years. But in recent times, there's been an enormous proliferation in the literature and also in the scientific research of psychopath. A fun fact is that in the 1980s, actually, when Ted Bundy was prosecuted for his crimes, many psychologists were actually starting to kind of give up on the diagnosis as if it was not really a real thing, if you will. But that has drastically changed in the last 30, 40 years, as I will talk about more here in this talk. All this literature describes psychopaths as having this psychological constellation a la Ted Bundy, right? So we were talking about an individual who are capable of masking, to use the American psychologist Herbert Cleckley's term here, masking their, if you will, their sanity or their insanity, if you will, that they come across as normal people but are utterly deprived in terms of their moral capacities and whatever we tend to think of as human pro-social qualities. And this has been documented or written about, I guess, in many different titles, and I'm just showing you 4 different titles here. I could have listed many, many more. Cleckley here describes, in his work, famously describes psychopath as if they're colorblind in terms of moral values. So just like a colorblind person can utter that he or she can utter the term for redness, for example, there's just no way that they will be able to really understand what redness is. In the analogy Cleckley is here drawing to psychopath is that where their dysfunction, their psychological dysfunction, really consists in the fact that they cannot comprehend moral values. So they can say that they think that this and that is right and wrong, but they don't really understand that is really what is going on with these individuals. Overall, psychopaths in more recent days have been, there are 4 fundamental facts that has been emphasized with about psychopaths. So where we can talk about all these different nuances that I have talked about here, there are 4 fundamental claims that seem to be emphasized more more readily in recent days. And the one perhaps obvious quality is that psychopaths are believed to be these extremely dangerous individuals. So human beings generally have dispositions to be to commit crimes and so on, but psychopaths are this very, very prolific subgroup of individuals who are enormously dangerous in terms of that they are criminally prolific, but they're also have propensities to much more brutal forms of violence. Psychopaths are also believed to be untreatable, meaning that whatever rehabilitation program or whatever psychiatric treatment we offer them, it doesn't seem to have much of an effect. That's the canonical view, if you will. And there are also some psychologists who think that psychopaths actually get worse if we try to treat them. Thirdly, it's also broadly believed that when I talk about this idea that psychopaths are morally blind, this comes out in various different expressions, such as lacking empathy or lacking remorse or lacking conscience or whatever you want to call it, right? But generally, this is the emphasis, that psychopaths are not just behaving badly, they're also psychologically disposed in a way that makes them incapable of, if you will, socializing. And fourth, there's this final claim that psychopaths are actually, that this personality disorder we're talking about has biological roots. So meaning that it's not just, that they decide to do this, that they decide to not care about certain values and norms or decide to commit crimes. No, there are actually evidence, according to the mainstream research, that psychopathy is rooted in or have abnormal neurobiological correlates. So there's something different about their brain, if you will, if you want to put it that way. Okay, so the problem of psychopaths, these individuals who match these four criteria that I'm talking about here, is that although that psychopaths are believed to be a very rare condition, they are allegedly disproportionately responsible for the majority of violent crimes in North America. And some researchers talk about that, or they estimate that actually a third of all the incarcerated individuals in our prisons and jails and so forth, that they are actually psychopaths. So we have this very small group who is disproportionately responsible for much of the social problems we have in our societies. And of course, some research have also calculated that this has enormous monetary toll on our society. And one estimate says that the cost of psychopaths surpasses $400 million a year in North America. $1 billion, which is not a small number. So it's not all bad, okay? Because during the last 3 decades, if you will, and especially the last 2 decades, there's been this dramatic change in how our judicial system deals with, or we should probably say, respond to the problem of psychopath. So we don't anymore just have this unrecognized psychiatric diagnosis that nobody's doing anything about. There's actually now standardized ways in which our judicial system is responding to psychopathic offenders. That usually takes the shape that there are standard procedures where we are trying to identify which of the criminals in our judicial system are also psychopaths. And then secondly, within the limits of the law, trying to constrain these individuals in whatever way we can. So once an offender enters the legal system, because they have committed some sort of offense, there's a high likelihood that, for example, in Canada, that person will also undergo or go through this process where we screen for whether the person is having this personality disorder we call psychopathy, and whether that should inform procedures such as constricting them all sorts of ways, which I will return to in a moment. Generally, the way this works, the first step of identifying individuals is that we use these things that we call psychopathy assessment tools, which are, without getting into the technicalities of it, they are what psychologists refer to as structured assessments, which often comes off as a checklist of things that we have to ascertain whether a person is matching these different items. So the PCLR, the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, is one tool, also the most used tool. And it lists the 18 traits here, or items, I should call them maybe, such as the person is glib and superficial, grandiose, self-worth, pathologically lying, conning, and manipulative. And all these different items here are kind of describing a stereotypical psychopath. So the idea is that if a person is matching these items to a significant degree, then we will consider whether we should diagnose the person as a psychopath. In praxis, there's a scoring system where you can score from 1 or 0 to 40 points. And if you're above the 30 points threshold, then you're conventionally or clinically seen as a psychopath, or you might say that we are then diagnosing a person as a psychopath. Now, the way this works in praxis then is that an offender who enters the judicial system because the person has been either is accused of a crime or has been found guilty, for example, will then eventually at some point undergo this assessment where we are assigning a psychologist or a psychiatrist to assess whether the person is also a psychopath. If the person scores high enough on, for example, the PCLR and gets the diagnosis of psychopathy, then we use that diagnosis to inform the further judicial way or pathway for this person. So whether this person should be allowed parole and so forth. So we are saying that this diagnosis will be used to constrict the individual. For example, in a sentencing and placement decision, so when a person is found guilty of a crime, a judge will have to decide whether the person who's found guilty should be given maybe a community sentence or a prison sentence, or if it's a prison sentence, should be a short or a longer sentence, right? And if the person has been diagnosed as a psychopath, that information can be used to further constricting the person. For example, giving the person a sentence that is in the higher end of the spectrum of the sentencing guidelines. It can also be something like, instead of giving the person a community sentence or probation, they're giving a prison sentence instead. It can also be on issues such as parole. So after an offender has served a certain part of their sentence, they can apply for this thing that is called parole, where they might be allowed to re-enter the society before their sentence is actually commuted or completed. And that can be to uphold a job or something like that. There are all different variations of parole, but if a person is diagnosed as a psychopath, that might have some constricting effects in the way that person will simply not be granted parole, for example. And there's also evidence that the psychopathy diagnosis is being used to simply refuse these individuals to take advantage of rehabilitation programs and treatment efforts that are within the judicial system, on the pretense, of course, that psychopaths don't change. So why should we allow them access to these programs that are designed to change offender behavior, for example? Okay. All this advocacy and all these policies and all these reasons for why we should constrict and detain psychopaths is well covered in the literature. I'm not going to go further into it here, but this is broadly how the psychopathy diagnosis has kind of made its way into the judicial system and being used today. And as you can see, some studies have documented that there's been actually a quite dramatic use or increase in the way the psychopathy diagnosis is used in our judicial systems here in North America, so in the United States, for example, and in Canada. So, for example, one study has documented that in the legal system in the United States, there's been an 8-fold increase, and that's just between 2000 and 2011 in the number of times that the diagnosis is used in court cases. We also know from surveys of these practitioners who conduct forensic evaluations that one of the most preferred practices is actually to assess for whether a person is a psychopath. And so we know that if we put together all these numbers and surveys we have, we know that in North America, there might be as many as several hundred thousands of these assessments conducted every year. It's a little bit difficult to say how many of these assessments are actually positive, if you will, because not everybody who has a psychopathy assessment will also be diagnosed as a psychopath. But if we just take the statistics of the estimates that says that 1/3 of all incarcerated individuals are psychopath, and then it's possible that we have maybe around 100,000 positive psychopathy assessments every year, which will make its way into the various different judicial decisions, right, in all sorts of ways. And that's really hard to track how much exactly this is influencing decisions, if you will. But that it does is quite obvious from these numbers. And I should perhaps also say that this is compared to to the status 30 years ago, where psychopathy was not even something we assessed for, basically. So virtually it didn't exist 30 years ago, right? So this is actually a new development that we have found to be infused into our legal system. Okay, but there's a problem with this. As I say, there's a problem with the problem of psychopath. Allow me to paint a picture for you here of what the problem of this is. So there's one scenario, right? So there's one scenario where it truly is the case that these people, these individual offenders we diagnose as psychopath, truly and empirically provable in a scientific way, also are the social predators that we are saying they are. So mind me, it's very easy to assume that when we say a psychopath, then it's also true that that person is going to be extraordinarily dangerous in the future. We can assume that, right? But we also have to be able to show it empirically that it's actually true, right? So in this one scenario of the story, the science is out, and the science, when we test psychopaths, we actually find that they are extraordinarily dangerous, and we are therefore also justified in legally constricting these individuals, right? But try to play devil's advocate here. It doesn't take much intellectual gymnastics to try to flip the narrative a little bit and see what happens, right? So imagine a scenario where it turns out that the individuals we diagnose as psychopath in our legal system, that when we study them, it turns out that they're actually not de facto these social predators that we thought they were. So when the individuals who get the diagnosis psychopath, when we measure their behavior in the future, it turns out that they're not more dangerous than any other individuals. Imagine if that was true. Imagine what that would mean to our legal system. I just mentioned that there are hundreds of thousands of people diagnosed as psychopaths every year in North America. And we are justifying these policies and practices on the basis that we are assuming that it's also true that they are more dangerous. But imagine if they are not. Then we are still treating them as if they are more dangerous. The little caveat here is just that they're not, right? So here we have what I am referring to as a scenario where we have maybe a clinical stigma, if that side of the story is true, right? And it shows how high the stakes really are. Like, they're enormously high, because we are taking this extra constrictive policies in place for these individuals, but we also have to know that they are justified, right? So one could ask, which one of these two scenarios are actually the most accurate? That's the main question. That's the, as I see it, the most interesting question right now in the science and study of psychopath. Which of these two scenarios are true? That's where we are right now. My team and I have tried to answer this question for the past 3 to 5 years, roughly. And it's not an easy question just to answer. It's quite technical at the end of the day, but we have tried to study some of the more low-hanging fruits, and that's what I'm going to share with you here the next 15 minutes with the results from these research. And I'm going to talk about 2 studies in particular. We have more and more studies coming out as they go through peer review, but these 2 studies here I think are the most informative, if you will, to this question about which of these 2 scenarios are actually true. So let me first talk about the one study, which also the largest study we did. It was published in 2020, I'm going to go over the results here. So we asked a very basic question, or actually we asked 3 basic questions. So remember that I said that there are generally 4 fundamental points that are emphasized about psychopath, namely that they are more dangerous, that they are untreatable, and they're without conscience. Well, in this study here, we asked those 3 questions. Is it really true that psychopaths are more dangerous, untreatable, and also without conscience? Like, that seems to be 2 very clear empirical questions, and it turns out that there's also a lot of empirical evidence on that. So there's a lot of evidence for us to review, and this is exactly what we did. We gathered all the evidence that researchers has published since the 1990s, which is not a small amount, I should say. It's so what we did is, I'm not going to go into the technicalities, but we performed what scientists call a systematic review, which is a methodological search of scientific publications, and then you try to aggregate, or at least try to generate an overview of what all this evidence is suggesting. So needless to say that there was a lot of reading and a lot of searching and a lot of data to go over, and it took quite some time. So let me share what we found here. So in terms of the first question, in terms of whether psychopath, and I'm here writing PCLR because we are talking about in science, when we talk about psychopaths, we are often talking about the people who are diagnosed with the Hare Psychopathy checklist revised. The way we measure whether these individuals are more dangerous than other individuals is simply to compare them. So how do we do that? How do we compare a psychopath to an ordinary offender? How do we figure out whether the one is more dangerous than the other? We don't just put them into a boxing ring or a cage and let them fight it out and see which one. Of course not. That would be highly unethical and highly scientifically stupid, to say it straight out, right? No, what we do is that we gather enough individuals that we know are psychopathic, have tested positive on the psychopath test and diagnosed as psychopath. And when they're eventually has served their sentence, and we eventually have to release them back into society, we then start to measure when they actually show up in our prisons again. And then we compare them to a control group of non-psychopathic offenders to see if the psychopath end up back in prison faster than the other non-psychopathic group. And if it is the case that this group of psychopathic individuals compared to the control group are faster at recidivating, as we call it technically, then we also think that that's good evidence of them being more dangerous, if you will. At least it suggests that they are more criminally prolific. Okay, so what did we find here in these comparison studies when we aggregated all the research from the last 30 years? Well, we found that the PCLR, and here it's a little bit technical, but we found that the PCLR psychopaths are actually more criminally prolific, but it was only with small effect sizes. So technically, I'm going to say a little bit more what that technically means. In forensic psychology, we often talk about whether this instrument PCL can predict whether a person is reoffending and to what degree it can do so. But I will talk a little bit more about that in the next slides here. So we found that there was some differences between psychopath and non-psychopath, but the differences were actually only weak to moderate, and that's a statistical claim. There were also a number of caveats that are interesting to highlight. It turns out that the PCLR, the people who are diagnosed as psychopath on the PCLR are actually less criminally prolific than people who are selected through using other instruments as high-risk offenders. So there are all sorts of ways the forensic psychologists can select which offenders are more dangerous. And it turns out that psychopaths are actually less dangerous than individuals who are selected using other tools, which is a little bit puzzling because psychopaths are supposed to be the worst of the worst, right? They're supposed to be the Ted Bundys of society. We also found that when we say that we find psychopaths are more criminally prolific than non-psychopaths after being released from prison, we want to know what exactly it is that is predicting that difference. And it turns out it's actually not their personality traits, which we measure in these in this instrument. It's actually just their past behavior. Because if you remember from that PCLR list, we're also measuring things like whether they have a juvenile record and things like that. And it's actually those traits or those items that are predicting whether a person is criminally prolific, which is a little bit puzzling again. It turns out that just the mere fact that we're trying to measure psychopathic personality traits actually decreases whether we can predict someone is criminally prolific. There's some technical terms in that I'm gonna leave out for now. Now, so what does that mean? Okay, let us just pause for a moment here. What are we saying when we say that there's a weak to moderate difference between these two groups? So remember, we have the psychopath versus the non-psychopathic offenders, right? And we want to know how much more how more dangerous psychopaths are compared to any ordinary offender, average offender that enters our legal system. Now, imagine a study, as I mentioned to you, where we have a group of individuals who are released from prison, and then we stand by the prison door and we wait for them to show up back in prison and see if we can figure out which of the two groups are more prolific, right? And we can imagine that when we are completed this study, we have like a normal distribution where some few people were really quick at recidivating. They ended up in prison really quick, and then the longer time, the more and more people come in, and then at some point we have most people in, and then when we waited say 4 years, only a few people started to trickle in, right? So we have this normal distribution. We can imagine that, at least. That's often also what we see. Now, let's say that this is the non-psychopathic group. So there's a normal distribution of the non-psychopathic group. So here's the question. How much more, meaning how quicker are psychopaths, the psychopathic group, at ending up in prison? How quicker are they when we say that there is a weak to moderate difference between these groups? Well, the picture looks something like this. So here, what I'm trying to overlay here is the difference. Psychopath would be the normal distribution of the darker curve here, and compared to the other distribution of the non-psychopathic. Clearly, there's a difference, right? And the difference is, in this case, calculated on an assumption that it's moderate difference. But I'm sure you can maybe are willing to accept the conclusion that it would be a little bit far-fetched to call this group normal offenders and this group social predators, right? That's not the difference we're finding here. between these two groups of individuals. Okay, let me go on to the other evidence that we also talked about. So we also talked about how psychopaths are untreatable. When we analyzed all the data, we found that there was absolutely no evidence that psychopath was unresponsive to common treatment and rehabilitation programs. This is merely not the case, or simply not the case. There was positive effects, whether you enrolled a psychopathic individuals in cognitive therapy or behavioral therapy. There's positive effects across these treatment targets. Secondly, remember that there's also this claim that psychopaths get worse when we treat them. We also found that there was no evidence of this. In fact, this idea was widely dismissed by researchers in the field, but it nevertheless is a narrative that seems to be living among practitioners, and generally just you find it all over in the field and general understanding of psychopathy. In fact, this idea that there's adverse treatment effects, some people might have heard of this very, very sad story in Ontario, forensic psychiatry, or I should say Canadian maybe forensic psychiatry, from up here in North Ontario, where, or probably not North Ontario, but north of Toronto, at least. Ontario is a big place, where individuals were actually tortured. So there was a class lawsuit that was completed in 2017, where a judge ruled that these patients in this program were actually being tortured. And I don't want to get into the details, but it was quite a horrific chapter and dark chapter of Canadian psychiatry. The only study that found that there were adverse treatment effects was actually from that institution. That's the only research that's ever found adverse treatment effect was from this study. Okay, what about the claim that psychopaths lack conscience? Well, like much of the other research, we found that there was no robust evidence that psychopaths have these moral incapacities that people keep talking about. For example, very surprising to us, there was not even a single study that claimed to analyze conscience and remorse. So remember, we have two very highly prolific or high-profile monographs titled Without Conscience and No Remorse, but there's not a single empirical study on psychopaths' conscience and remorse. That's very puzzling to a scientist. If you call something without conscience, you would at least assume that the person has measured these individuals' conscience. That's not the case with this field. We found that there was some tentative evidence that psychopaths have differences in empathic responses, but that not this idea that there's this wholesale incapacity to empathize. That was not the case either. Finally, when you compare psychopaths and non-psychopaths in their responses to moral questions, there's a handful of studies have done that. There are also no differences. It seems like psychopaths make exactly the same moral judgment. They seem to have exactly the same moral opinion as other ordinary offenders. Okay, so I'm throwing a lot of evidence at you here, and I know that it might go very fast to some people because there's so much maybe that is interesting. But let me just quickly, before we end here, say a little bit about this final fourth thing. So remember, I've just talked about how the claim about psychopaths being more dangerous, the claim that psychopaths are untreatable, and then the claim that they're morally incapacitated. But there's also this fourth claim that psychopathy is a biological condition, that there's something different about psychopathic individuals' brain. So what we did in this study was that, so you can find the claim that psychopaths have abnormal brains all over the literature. I'm going to say a little bit about that. But what we decided to do was to analyze whether there's coding bias in the field. Coding bias can be a little bit technical to explain, but generally what we want to find is whether, so imagine that you have all the research that is being conducted and published on psychopath brain. All that research often gets condensed into something we call reviews, right? So we wanted to track whether the research from all the research results gets accurately represented in the review literature, because it's often the review literature that practitioners and attorneys and so on go to if they want to have a picture of the scientific status in a field, right? So it's very important that that the review literature is accurately reporting what the aggregate of research has said. So what we did was that we wanted to make this comparison, basically. I'm not going to go into the technicalities of this. So as I mentioned, there's all these claims that psychopath brains are significantly and abnormally different from non-psychopathic individuals. And this has, and the reason why this is also important, I should perhaps also mention, is that this evidence is starting to make its way into the court system as well. So we are now actually seeing cases where an attorney will mention that this person is a psychopath and there's something wrong, something abnormal about this individual's brain. I could talk much more about that also, but I just wanted to leave it in there for people who are curious about this. So what we did was that we located all the original research and all the review research. So kind of like comparing, right? So all the research we have here, is that accurately represented in the review literature and the meta-analysis we have over here? It's a fairly simple analysis, but it takes some quite of a workload, but the analysis itself is quite simple. And here's what we found. The darker column here represents all the null findings. So all the research, all the effects that turned out to just show that there's no difference between psychopath brain and non-psychopath brain. So think about this as the percentage of results that showed that there was just no difference, or wasn't really informative in any way. It was just, we didn't find anything. We were searching for something, but we didn't find something. We see here that in the neuroimaging literature, the structural neuroimaging literature, roughly in these time intervals here, with 5 years apart, the proportion of all the results in this field are, the majority of it is actually just findings that there are no really significant results, that we cannot really find what we are hypothesizing, and therefore it's inconclusive, or the conclusion is that there's no difference, right? But look at these columns here underneath here. These represent how big a portion of the review literature, how big of a portion of all the studies that review literature mentions contains null findings. So another way to put this is that if you were reading a review study, you would on average think that only 3% of the results in this field are null findings, where the reality is that it's actually 60%. It's a complete, you can see over time, this has also been downwatered or outwatered. So there's a complete misrepresentation in the literature on whether psychopaths really are biologically different in terms of their neurobiology. Okay, so there are some important observations here I'm going to mention before I end here, and we can go to the Q&A. So here's the status, right? This is the deal with the deal. Today, hundreds of thousands of individuals in North America are being subject to these psychopathy assessments. It's tens of thousands in Canada at least. Nobody really knows the precise number, but it's up there. Many of these individuals are then diagnosed as psychopath. Not all of them, but some of them are. Presumably a third, if we should believe some of the leading estimates at least. These individuals who are diagnosed as psychopath have their processes, their legal processes, constricted to some significant degree, whether that is a longer sentence, whether that is a denial of rehabilitation program access, whether that is denial of parole, or whatever it may be. Their legal process is constricted because of this diagnosis. The problem is just that this diagnosis is not indicative of an extraordinary social predator. This is what the label is saying, but it's actually not the reality behind the label. So we here have what I think is a clinical stigma. If we understand by clinical stigma, a label that gets attached to an individual and then has all sorts of negative consequences for that individual down the line. Individuals who are denied parole, denied access to rehabilitation, they don't think that's a nice and good thing. They would rather prefer that it would be the other way around, right? But more importantly, this diagnosis is not helping society. It's not making society safer. Because remember, we are diagnosing psychopath under the pretense that we are going to be making society much safer. That's what is justifying the use of this tool, the use of these assessments. But that's not what's going on. We can see that in the empirical literature. I think there are some important questions here. I'm just going to mention two that we can talk about in the Q&A, but I think here that we should ask ourselves, of course, in the future, should we stop using these tools? Should we stop using psychopathy assessments? My opinion about this is that we should, and I've expressed this in literature, but I also think there are some hard questions. What do we do with the individuals who had their legal process constricted in this way under this false pretense? What do we do with those individuals? Not so much in Canada, but in the United States, many juvenile offenders have been transferred to adult courts because of a psychopathy diagnosis. What do we do with those individuals? Secondly, I think that maybe this empirical data that we are seeing here, I think it's foreshadowing something much more central and perhaps even scientifically more interesting also. Namely that perhaps this diagnosis we refer to as psychopathy is actually not a real diagnosis. It may just be nothing but clinical lore. And we have here individuals that psychiatrists historically might not have been able to fully understand, maybe because they have some misleading ideas of what normal human nature is like. And then they have invented this diagnosis that might not really pick out anything real in real life, if you will. It's not really addressing a real thing when we use this term psychopathy. Okay, I will stop my talk with these questions here, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, we have a few questions in the chat. The first one I'm going to ask you, Professor Larsen, is every inmate assessed using the PCLR upon incarceration or conviction? How common is its use?
That's an excellent question. The real answer to this is that we don't really know, we don't know the precise number, but we do know that the majority of the more violent forms of crimes and the more serious forms of crimes, every individual or most individuals are subject to what we call a forensic evaluation. And a forensic evaluation can have many components to it, but it's often the case, and according to some surveys, it's about half the case or 2/3 of the case, depending on what survey we look at. Those forensic evaluation will have a component where they also assess for psychopathy. So if I should just sling out a quick estimate, I think that it's probably something like 2/3 of when we get into the more serious forms of crimes are going to be subject to a psychopathy assessment in one way or the other. And that can, I should also say, that can happen in different stages. Sometimes it's before the trial, sometimes it's after the trial when you enter a legal institution. It can also be much later when you get into to a parole application. So it can happen in many different phases of your process through the legal system. But if I say 2/3 of individuals, I don't think I have overstated.
Okay, that's a very general question. The next question is very specific. So I'm going to read it right from the chat. Do you consider the fact that many of the traits identified in the PCLR groups of traits are also traits that may make it far less likely that their criminality will be reported? And it goes on, for example, manipulation resulting in convincing victims not to report. If so, is there a way to account for that?
Yes. So that's a very classic question, right? So so if people can notice here that there's this trait called pathological lying in the assessment of psychopathy, and it has been a much discussed item. I don't necessarily think it's that consequential because I actually do think we can detect whether people are lying. There are ways to do that, but whether I think what the person is really asking is whether there are ways in which true psychopaths can kind of train themselves, because remember, they're often portrayed as having this facade of utter normalcy. And it takes a trained, skilled forensic psychologist perhaps to see through that, right? So can true psychopath really dodge in a way these assessments, so forensic psychologists don't really find them, and so when we look at the data, maybe even that it goes that deep, the question, I don't know, but when we look at the data, we're not actually catching all the psychopaths, and that's why we find these discrepancies. I don't really think that that's the case. Personally, I've yet to see evidence that psychopaths are all these elusive, pathologically lying, slick individuals who can just smoothly go under the radar in our judicial system. I don't think these individuals really exist in this grand scheme of things. I think forensic psychologists and generally people who work in the judicial system, they're pretty trained to look through all these things. So I don't necessarily see that as a big problem as such.
Okay. The next question is about the cost of psychopaths. You mentioned $400 billion. Are there facts to back that number up?
In my own opinion, no. But here's how the number is calculated. When the individuals have done who have come up with these numbers is they look at the total cost of crime. So the total cost of crime in society can be calculated, or I should say it can be estimated. And it's a very complex calculation, mind you. It's not. There's vast studies on how to calculate it, and there's of course also a big spectrum of what we believe the overall cost of crime is in the Canadian society, for example, or the U.S. and so forth. But we can nevertheless come up with an estimate. And what the psychopathy researchers then do is that they simply say that, okay, we believe that a third of all criminals are psychopaths. Well, then we just take a third of that number. And that's your number. That's your $400 billion plus $400 billion in the United States. I don't think that's how you should do calculations like that. And I'm not sure how much that number is really meaning you. But the reason why I bring it up is because that's part of the canonical narrative about psychopaths. And that's why people get funding to study psychopaths, because it's such a grave social problem and expensive problem. So they justify saying, hey, if you give me X number of dollars to make this study, maybe I can save you money down the line if I can develop a treatment program that can make psychopaths better and so on. So that's often how these numbers kind of pop up in real life. But whether they're actually saying anything, I'm not sure.
There's a question about diagnosing psychopathy. Is it possible to diagnose psychopathy without any contact or communication with the subject? And I'd like to tie that into all the studies. Are the studies actually based on real people or just coming out of them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's actually debate in the scholarship about this, but the consensus is that no, the only way you can study psychopaths is to arrange for an interview with individuals, and then every time you diagnose a person as a psychopath, that person, sometimes literally, but also more in a figurative way in terms of scientific reasons, becomes part of your sample size. But it involves that you have to sit down with the person and conduct a structured interview with the individual, trying to assess whether the person matches these. There are studies that try to develop self-report measures. So where you send an HTML link to an individual, and then you click on all sorts of questions and try to respond, and then it calculates whether you're a psychopath or not. The broad agreement in the field is that that's not a thing. So you can do that online. I'm sure you can find the psychopathy test online, but you shouldn't think that forensic psychologist thinks that that's anything worth anything. It's really just, you know, a fun thing to do, but it's not really what they're talking about. When they talk about psychopath, it's people who have been, when they talk about diagnosed psychopath, we're talking about individuals who have been assessed by a trained professional forensic psychologist and has undergone interviews. And also the clinicians often have access to that individual's personal records, and sometimes even have access to speaking to their family members and things like that. Yeah, so there's a lot of work that goes into making an assessment like this.
Okay. If we shouldn't use the PCLR, what's the alternative to identify reoffending, unremorseful, actually dangerous individuals who need to be kept away from society? And there's some examples here: BTK, Green River, Dahmer, etc.
Yes, that's an excellent question. And I really enjoyed that question. I thank you very much for that question. Because there are individuals in our society that are dangerous, more dangerous than others. And nothing could be more obvious when we encounter individuals such as BTK and so forth. All the infamous serial killers that we know of. So what do we do here? What I'm saying with these studies, and what these studies are showing us, is that this tool, this diagnosis, doesn't do the work. Okay, that's what that's showing. Now, just because this tool cannot do the heavy lifting that we want it to do, it still means that there's still a demand out there for us to be able to do heavy lifting like this. We want to be able to select who are more dangerous. Now, I'm not sure this is actually such a big problem that we are making it up to be. So there are two sides of this. What about the extreme individuals such as BTK, Ted Bundy, and so forth? Well, the reality is that these individuals would be in prison whether or not you have conducted a psychopathy assessment, because they have been found guilty of horrendous crimes that normally give them many years life in prison and so forth, right? So those are not really our problem here. This is not what this tool is designed to do. We can detect these individuals by just looking at their crimes. Newsflash, if a person has killed 10 people, he is probably not a nice guy, and you probably don't want to let that person out again. That's how our legal system makes those decisions, and it's probably a sound decision. The other side of this token is that we still want to figure out who are more dangerous than the average. And see, the thing is, there are many reasons why people are more dangerous. There are many factors that can contribute to a person's, should we say, risk profile, right? It could be that the person has severe problems with drug abuse. It could be that and combined with socioeconomic factors that makes them very vulnerable to commit crimes, maybe to support their drug abuse. There are all sorts of risk factors, and we are really good at detecting these, actually. So remember that I told you earlier in this talk that other risk assessment tools are actually better than the PCLR to detect who's going to recidivate. It actually is true that we have tools that are designed in all sorts of different ways to ascertain or assess, if you will, whether the person is of high or low risk. And it takes all sorts of factors into consideration. I think if you want to make risk assessments ingrained part of the judicial system, which is already is, that is probably the most sound direction you can go. There's still problems with these, by the way, but I think that looking at risk as a more broader factor, if you will, is probably the way to go, instead of looking at something as narrow as a psychiatric diagnosis here.
Mm-hmm. There's a question about research in conduct disorder for youths as a precursor for the diagnosis of psychopathy.
Yeah. Sorry, so that's, what was the question again?
well, I'll read it exactly as it's put in the chat. Is there similar research on conduct disorder for youths, or do you have plans to do any, given that it is a precursor to the for the diagnosis of psychopathy?
Yes. So are there similar research? The answer is yes. There was researchers in the 1990s, mid-1990s and early 2000s were especially enthusiastic about research on juvenile psychopathy or youth psychopathy, it was called. There's actually this checklist here has a version that is designed for juvenile offenders. That line of research has cooled quite substantially in recent years because it turned out that it's very difficult to show that there's this thing called juvenile psychopathy and that these individuals are more prolific. And there was also a burst of misuses of this tool. So I don't know how old the person who's asking the question is, but they might recall that in the 1990s there was North American societies were dealing with very high crime rates, and the focus of this debate quickly became the focus on juvenile offenders, and there was all these changes to legal system where juvenile offenders, if they committed a crime that was considered a crime if they were an adult, or committed an offense that was considered a crime when they're adult, they would be automatically transferred to adult courts. The youth version of this PCL instrument very quickly became an instrument to make that argument that you should transfer. So there was a lot of scholars that wanted to restrain the use of this. So the research kind of cooled. But the last part of the question was really saying that, or stating that juvenile psychopathy is a precursor to psychopathy. What I'm saying here is that there's no such thing as juvenile psychopathy and psychopathy. There might be juvenile offenders that you consider to be very callous and very socially different than other normal youth, for example. But there's no evidence to suggest that that is actually a good predictor of risk. So we have to pause our biases here. Just because a person appears to you to be glib, superficial, lacking remorse, and so on, that's not necessarily a good predictor of whether that person is going to be more criminally prolific in the future. So that's the problem here. I know we are running a little bit out of time here, but I just want to quickly also emphasize part of the problem. I know it sounds very intuitive to say that if a person is lacking guilt, has no empathy, is cunning and manipulative, and so forth, that then they're also more dangerous. Of course, that makes sense, right? But let me ask you this. Can you really ascertain whether a person lacks remorse and guilt? Can you really ascertain whether they have a callous lack of empathy? Mind you, you have 30 minutes as a psychologist to speak to this individual. Are you really getting the true self of this individual in that interview? Can you really assess that? Imagine how many times you sit with your friends and spend hours and hours chatting with them, and years down the line, you're surprised by certain personality traits of theirs. Why do you think is anything different with individuals into the legal system? You should actually think that is much worse, because they are not going to show their real self to a psychologist. Why would they open their hearts to those individuals? So I think we have to be humble about the situation instead of trying to create these etched in stone type tools that just take all these assumptions that we can do all these things that in reality we cannot actually do. So we have to find better and more ingenious ways where, by the way, this is where the students, the future students, come in. This is their work. They have to improve these procedures. I think we can. I don't think we can do it in this way here, right? Like these tools. I think there are other better ways. Sorry, that was a very long answer to a very brief question.
But very interesting. There's a question about your bar charts. It seems to show that more recent MRI results do show differences in psychopath brains. Could better MRI technology be revealing actual brain differences?
Yeah, so it's not exactly what the bars are showing, but so structural magnetic resonance imaging technology is a certain way of looking at the brain. You're basically just looking at the structures of your brain. There's also other sorts of imaging techniques such as functional magnetic resonance imaging. And we're actually currently working on a similar study on the functional data, which, by the way, is I can reveal is not looking any better than this. There are all sorts of problems with neuroimaging research. Listen, if you are of the conviction, as me and many others in the field, or growing number of individuals in the field, that there's actually no such thing called psychopathy, then you can search all you want in that magnetic resonant imaging machine to find something, but you're not going to find something. But that's the ideal picture. The problem is that you can probably always find something in individuals. These tools measure, they don't necessarily measure what you think they're measuring. They're in the functional data, they're measuring metabolism in your brain. And there are all sorts of ways in which your metabolism can be different in a certain moment of the day compared to another one. There are all sorts of ways that this data can be not manipulated from the researcher side, which it can, by the way, but it's not necessarily the problem. The problem is that we don't really know and have broad agreements on how to interpret all this data. And the problem with neurobiology is that the brain is a very complicated organ. And in a complicated organ, you can always find something. The problem is that when we find something, it rarely matches the other things you found in other studies. So we keep finding results that just never match each other. And that's in science, that's called that you're never really replicating anything. And when you're not replicating anything in science, you're not finding anything. That's a general approach to interpreting scientific data. There's much more to be said about this, by the way, but I think this is the best I can do with this limited time here.
I'm going to ask you one last question. People with this clinical stigma attached to them, they're being discriminated against, and that will have legal ramifications down the road, right?
True. That's my, it's not an opinion. I think this is empirically supported conclusion that people are being diagnosed with psychopathy because it's a standard procedure in a legal system. And those who are being diagnosed as psychopath, they are not those social predators that we call them and think that they are. We are still, however, treating them as if they are social predators. I think that is wrong. I don't think any reasonable citizen think that that's how our legal system should use, for the main reason that it's not helping the society. It's not making the society safer. And for the, if you will, the secondary reason is actually harmful to the individuals who are in our legal system. Imagine if you were in for a crime, given a prison sentence instead of probation because a forensic psychologist had deemed you a psychopath. Imagine if you're sitting there and you get that treatment by the legal system. Are you going to be a healthy and willing citizen once you return in society, or are you going to be slightly more dissatisfied with the system? I actually think, if anything, this tool might be making our societies less safe because it's actually promoting injustices. And if there's something human beings don't like, then it's injustice.
Yeah, there are still a few more questions coming in, but I think that's an excellent place to end. Thank you very much, Professor Larsen. If you stop sharing, we'll start sharing our slides again.
I can get it there. I think, there we go.
Okay.